Okay, so Shvua Tov, good morning. This week we will be learning the Parsha of Toldos. In it, we learn about very briefly about the life of Yitzchak. And today we're going to study a section that discusses when there was a famine during the days of Yitzchak, similar to his father Avram, and we're going to analyze how Yitzchak attempted to leave Eretz Yisrael, similar to his father Avram, who went to Mitzrayim, went to Egypt. As well, Yitzchak's son Yaakov, many years later, we know there was a famine, and at that time, his son Yosef was the second in command and power in Mitzrayim. So Yaakov as well went to Mitzrayim. And the Shvatim and his children lived there for some time. But pertaining to Yitzchak, things went a little bit different. So in the Parsha of Toldos, in Perek Chavav, chapter 26, Pasuk Aleph. Vayihi Rav Ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. Novad harav harishon. This is besides the first famine, Asher Haya b'mei Avram, that was in the days of Avram. Vayelech Yitzchak, and Yitzchak went to Avimelech Melech Plishtim Gerara. So he goes to Gerar, which is the Philistine territory where Avimelech was king. Doesn't tell us that he was going down to Mitzrayim. However, in the subsequent pasuk, in pasuk Beis, by Yera Elav Hashem, Hashem appears to Yitzchak Vayemer, and he says, Al Terid Mitzrayim, do not go down to Mitzrayim. Shchoin Ba'aretz, you should reside and inhabit the land, Asher Omer Elecha, that I'm going to tell you about. Gur Ba'aretz Hazos, settle in this land, Ve'eya Imach, Imcha, and I will be with you. And Hashem gives him a blessing. So Rashi says, what's this idea? He went to Gerar, and now Hashem's saying, don't go down to Mitzrayim, because Yitzchak intended to go down to Mitzrayim, and Hashem said, don't go. Now, Rashi proceeds to explain, why not? Avram, his father, went to Mitzrayim. Yaakov, his son, went to Mitzrayim. Why is Yitzchak any different? So Rashi says that in his words, Amar loy al tered Mitzrayim, don't go down to Mitzrayim. Sha'ata ola tmima, you are an ola tmima, a perfect burnt offering. Ein chutz la'aretz kedaylach, and the diaspora chutz la'aretz is not fitting for you. What does he mean that Yitzchak was a burnt offering? So we go back to the Parsha Vayera, where Hashem commands Avram to bring his son Yitzchak as an offering on the Akedah. And as he binds his son Yitzchak and he is about to slaughter him as an offering, Hashem says, don't touch your son. And then Avram notices that there is a ram, and he takes the ram as an offering. And the Torah says, "Vayalei la'ola tachas b'no." He offers this ram in the place of his son. What does it mean? That everything that Avram intended to do to his son, the slaughtering and the offering of the ram, it was in the place of Yitzchak. But nevertheless, since Yitzchak was offered up on the Mizbeach as an offering, as a carbon, so then he assumed a whole new status. Just as one were in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, they would bring a offering to the Mizbeach. The offering now became consecrated, became holy and sanctified. And thus, it had a very, very special status. So too, Yitzchak had the status of a carbon. As such, Hashem is telling Yitzchak, Chutz la'aretz is not fitting for you. You should not leave Eretz Yisrael, remain here, because the diaspora is not appropriate for you to go to. And therefore, when Yitzchak, there's a famine in Eretz Yisrael, he goes to Gerar, but he intends to travel to Mitzrayim, Hashem says, remain in Eretz Yisrael, do not go down to Mitzrayim. This is the interpretation of Rashi. And the Midrash says something similar along those lines. The Midrash says that Rab Hoshea says that, and he interprets the verse that it says, settle in this land, that Yitzchak had the status of a Ola Tmima, as we mentioned before, but he says something a little bit different. Just like a burnt offering is invalidated when it is taken outside of its prescribed area, if you go outside the land of Israel, you'll be invalidated. In other words, in the times of the temple, when people would bring sacrifices, every sacrifice had a certain boundary within which it had to be. So if it was there were different types of sacrifices. There was the burnt offering, there was the peace offering, there was the daily offerings and the Thanksgiving offerings, et cetera, et cetera. Each one had a certain degree of sanctity. The more stringent ones, the meat, the animal, even those that were eaten by the priests, by the Kohanim and others, or by the owners, they had to eat it within certain precincts in the Beis HaMikdash. Some had to be within the Azara in the courtyard. Others were able to be taken out of the Beis HaMikdash area, but had to remain within the walls of Yerushalayim. So if the meat of the animal was taken outside those boundaries, it would become puzzle, it would become invalidated. Thus, Hashem is telling Yitzchak, you are an Ola Tmima, and therefore, if you are taken outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, you will become invalidated because you are like a carbon. So it would seem at face value that Rashi and the Midrash are essentially saying the same thing. Don't go out of Eretz Yisrael because you are a carbon Ola, you're an Ola Tmima, and therefore you should not leave and go down to Mitzrayim. However, the Rebbe analyzes the Midrash and Rashi, and he says if you actually read carefully what they're actually saying two different things. As a way to visualize the difference between Rashi and the Midrash, we could give an example, an analogy. If you have a child who is right now enrolled in a university, in a college, and this child decides that they want to go transfer out to a different college, a different university in a different country, in a different land. And the parent says, listen, I understand you want to leave. However, I used to be an alum. I used to go to this university, this college. I know the faculty, I know the curriculum. It has very, very high caliber of education and learning and environment. I don't think you should go to the other place because this is where you're going to really maximize your talents. This is where you, I think, are going to really, really excel and do the best because there's something very, very special about this program. That's one way. That's one analogy. And the second one is in another scenario where the child goes, the student is enrolled in this university and they want to go to a different country, different land where there's a different university. And the parent has been to that other country, that other land. And the parent says to the child, listen, my child, I know you want to go to this other place, but I've been there. I know the people, I know the place, the milieu, the environment is not really great, very, very poor standard of education. And I think that if you go there, it's going to have a very debilitating effect on your character, on your education, on your general, all your ambitions in life. I think your quality of life will become eroded and degraded if you go there. In other words, what's the difference between these two scenarios? In scenario number one, the parent is telling the child that I think you should stay in this college because this place has tremendous qualities. He is highlighting, stressing the positive that this place has. Stay here because this is where you belong. This is where you're really going to excel. This is where you're really going to bring out the best of your potential. And the second scenario, what we're saying is, don't go to that place because there's something negative about the other place that you're going to, where that place is an inferior environment. It's not a great circumstance to put yourself into, and if it does, it will negatively affect you. And in a sense, this is the difference between the Midrash and Rashi. In fact, we can actually see it in the words of the Torah that they are explaining. Because in the verse, in Pasuk Beis, Hashem says two things. Vayere love Hashem, Vayomer Hashem says to him, he says, Al tered Mitzrayim, don't go down to Mitzrayim, Shchon ba'aretz. Don't go down to Mitzrayim. And then in the next verse, it says, Gor ba'aretz hazos, settle in this land. So he's saying two things. Don't go down there, and you don't go down to Mitzrayim, and settle here in Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi's interpretation is on the words Al Teir Mitzrayim. When Hashem said, don't go down to Mitzrayim, Rashi says, don't go down to Mitzrayim because you are an Ola Tmima. Chutz la'aretz, the diaspora is not fitting for you. Here Rashi is emphasizing the negative. Don't go down to Mitzrayim because of your stature, that place is not fitting for you. That's like the father or mother who says to the child, don't go to the university in that other country because it's not good for you. I don't think it's going to be a conducive environment for your growth, for your maturity, for your education, and so on. The Midrash is interpreting not the words Al Teir Mitzrayim, don't go down to Mitzrayim, rather the words Gor ba'aretz hazos, settle in this land, in the positive. Stay here in Eretz Yisrael. You are an Ola Tmima. You're a person of higher stature and status. You have the sanctity and the holiness of a carbon. This is where you should be. Settle here. So we see two different perspectives as to what precisely Hashem was telling Yitzchak. He's telling him, don't go there, stay here. But which one are we emphasizing? Which one are we highlighting? Rashi seems to underscore that place is the place where you should not be because it's not befitting for you, and it will degrade and negatively harm your spiritual status and stature. And the Midrash is highlighting the positive. Stay here in Eretz Yisrael. There's something positive about here, and this is where you belong. The Rebbe analyzes the Rashi and the Midrash and provides fascinating insight into each one, why each one had their perspective. And ultimately, where we're going to go with this is because this will give us an insight into a perspective in life where when we talk about environments and we talk about our surroundings, our milieu, the places that and spaces that we live in, and we try to inspire ourselves and educate our children, it's to give us a perspective in life as to how to create the proper environment for ourselves, and how do we balance between, on the one hand, needing to be in our own space, creating an environment that is healthy and productive and conducive for spiritual growth. On the other hand, sometimes we need to go out into the world, into the diaspora, as it were. And this is the balance that we strive to, and we seek to strike a balance between these two priorities in life. So first, we need to understand what exactly was the debate between Rashi and the Midrash. In other words, the Midrash is focusing on the positive of Eretz Yisrael. Rashi is focusing on the negative of the diaspora. Are we to say that Rashi did not see in Israel the positive qualities? Why was Rashi not highlighting? Why was he not stressing the virtues, the qualities of Eretz Yisrael? So there is a debate as to whether at that juncture, at that moment, was Eretz Yisrael a holy place? We know that Eretz Yisrael, there's what we know as Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, the holiness, the sanctity of the land. Many, many mitzvos, many commandments are contingent and are related to the very sanctity of the land. Truma, Meiser, many agricultural laws and other laws that are associated with Eretz Yisrael, which are only fulfilled on various produce and other things that are native or grown in Eretz Yisrael. So clearly we know today there's something inherently there's something inherent about Eretz Yisrael that is holy and special. But was that the case in the time of Avram Avinu and Yitzchak and Yaakov, our ancestors? Perhaps, maybe, if the Midrash were to say that Eretz Yisrael was a holy place, that's why he says, Yitzchak, stay here. It's a holy place. You belong here. Maybe Rashi didn't believe in that. However, according the way the Rebbe explains it, and it's a fascinating thing, at that time, Eretz Yisrael, according to the way the Rebbe explains many of the commentators, most commentators do not believe that Eretz Yisrael was a holy land at that time. And this is based on various factors, but we'll mention some of them. Number one, we don't find when the Torah or many of the commentators or even the Avos themselves, when they spoke about the land, it was not called Eretz Yisrael. The Torah refers to at that time as Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan. Here is a big point. There is a halacha, there is a law, or in Rambam, that it is forbidden to leave Eretz Yisrael. Someone who resides and dwells, lives in Eretz Yisrael, is forbidden to leave the land, at least on a permanent basis. There's only very few exceptions. A person who's living in Eretz Yisrael is permitted to leave. Some of the heterim, some of the exemptions are to get married, to study Torah. There are cases of when there's a pidyon shvoyim to rescue somebody. There are very few exemptions for a person to leave Eretz Yisrael. And yet, we find by our ancestors, by the Avos, they left Eretz Yisrael without any regard, it would seem, for that halacha. We know the Avos, they fulfilled all the commandments, as we've mentioned in the past. Avram Avinu fulfilled all the mitzvahs of the Torah even before it was given. Certainly he would fulfill a law that prohibits leaving Eretz Yisrael. And yet we find multiple times Avram left Eretz Yisrael. According to many, the Bris Ben Absarim took place when Avram was 70 years old. And we know in the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, Hashem tells Avram to go from Haran to Lech Lecha, and he left from Haran to Eretz Yisrael. But the Torah says he was 75 then. So the Bris Ben Absarim, if it happened in Eretz Yisrael, why is Hashem telling Avram again, go to the land of Canaan? So the explanation is, Avram, we mentioned this in the class of Lech Lecha, Avram went to Eretz Yisrael twice. He once went when he was 70 years old, the Bris Ben Absarim. Hashem promised him the land. He went back to Haran. Then a second time, 5 years later, Hashem tells him, go back to Eretz Yisrael. So here, already, once Avram was in Eretz Yisrael, he left for 5 years until he came back. And then we read about how Avram, in the parsha in Vayera, in Lech Lecha rather, how there was a famine, and he goes down to Mitzrayim, and that whole saga that happened over there. So what's the heter? What is the exemption? So now you can say there was a famine. Okay, but we know that even to leave for a cause, for a reason that's related to a lack of food, it's not so simple. The Rambam talks about Machlon and Kilyon. Some of you may be familiar with the story with Rus, which was in the time that there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael, and Machlon and Kilyon left, and they went to the land of Moab, and that's where they married Naomi and Rus, Arpa and Rus rather, and Naomi who was the mother. What happened? They went back to Eretz Yisrael because their husbands died. Machlon and Kilyon died. And the explanation is, why did they die? Because they were Gedolei Hador, they were the great leaders of the generation, and it was inappropriate for them to leave, because of their great stature, for them to leave their brethren and to go away and leave Eretz Yisrael. So the Rambam says, because of that, they were judged very harshly. So certainly someone on the status of Avram to leave Eretz Yisrael because of a famine would show a certain lack of faith, if it wasn't permitted. How could we say that Avram left Eretz Yisrael? And we see the same thing later with Yaakov. There was a famine, as we mentioned before. We know in the parsha of Vayeshev and Miketz, we read about the story about the sale of Yosef, and ultimately in Miketz, where he interprets the dreams of Paro that there's going to be the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And indeed, there was a famine. The Shvatim, they go down to Mitzrayim to obtain food. And then finally, through the whole scheme and drama with Yosef and the brothers, and he accuses them of spies and so on, ultimately Yaakov also comes down to Mitzrayim, and he lives for 17 years. The very last years of his life, he lives in Mitzrayim. So how are we to explain that the Avos disregarded this law not to depart Eretz Yisrael? And therefore, the conclusion is, the Rebbe says, that at that time, Eretz Yisrael was not an inherently sacred place yet. It's something that came later on with the conquest of Yehoshua, and subsequently, many years later, with Ezra, where the land became inherently holy. Now, what qualities did Eretz Yisrael have? So on this, perhaps, so therefore, in terms of the holiness, both Rashi and the Midrash both would agree that Eretz Yisrael is not a holy place. So the question remains then, so that would explain why Avram and Yaakov were able to leave Eretz Yisrael with complete disregard, so to speak, with the law of prohibiting departure from Eretz Yisrael. But that would raise the question about Yitzchak. Why was Yitzchak any different? The land wasn't holy. Why can't he not leave? So perhaps we could say that maybe Eretz Yisrael was not there was no kedusha in Eretz Yisrael. The question is to the ownership. Who owned Eretz Yisrael at that point? And we touched upon this topic last week a little bit in terms of the ownership and the negotiation between Avram and the Bnei Ches. So we know in the Parsha of Lech Lecha, when Hashem, with the Bris Ben Absarim that we mentioned before, Hashem made a covenant with Avram. And in Parshas Lech Lecha, in Perek Tezvav Pasuk Ches, Hashem tells Avram the following. Bayomahu, on that day, Karas Hashem es Avram bris. Hashem struck a covenant with Avram, Lamar saying, L'zaracha, to your descendants, Nasati es haaretz hazos. I have given the land, this land, Minahar Mitzrayim, from the river of Egypt, Ad Hanar Hagadol, until the great river, Nahar Pras, the Euphrates River. Asakeni, Asaknizia Kadmoni, the lands of all of the 7 nations. But what's interesting, the term that the Torah uses, that Hashem said to Avram, L'zaracha nasati, to your descendants, nasati, I have given this land. It would seem to imply that at the Bris Ben Absar, when Avram was 70 years old, already at that point, Hashem says, I have given you this land. So what does this mean? Over here also, there's a debate between the way the Rashi explains it, and then there is the way the Midrash explains it. Rashi says, Zaracha, Nasati, the word Nasati, Rashi explains, Amirase shel Hashem ki ilu hi asuya, that the words, the speech of Hashem, it's as if it's already been done. In other words, Hashem, he's all powerful. And therefore, when he says, I will do something, it's as if it happened, because there's nothing that could hold back. There's nothing that could hinder Hashem's will. And therefore, Hashem says, I have done it. It doesn't mean that it actually happened. It means to say that it's inevitable. And it's just a matter of time. It's as if it already, we could deem it as if it already happened. Because ultimately, the reality is, the Jewish people only came to Eretz Yisrael many, many hundreds of years later, some 400 years later, with Yehoshua. So why are we saying I gave it? Because it's as if I already gave it. However, the Midrash says something else. It says, Ma'amare shel Hashem Maaseh. The speech, the words of Hashem is action. Not it's as if it's action, it is actual, something that already transpired. So in other words, according to Rashi, he's saying that at the Bris Ben Absarim, the Avos, Avram, and his descendants did not actually acquire the land of Eretz Yisrael. The Midrash is saying no. Already we had ownership of the land. But even the Midrash is not saying that it became holy and we possessed it in the way that it was in future generations, but there was a level of ownership that the Avos had over Eretz Yisrael, which is different than what we explained last week, because last week was based more on the interpretation of Rashi, but that's for another time. But what is the takeaway from this? The takeaway is that we have two opinions. The opinion of Rashi that there was no ownership and of Eretz Yisrael, and the Midrash says that there was. So according to the Midrash, we could perhaps better explain why Yitzchak could not depart Eretz Yisrael. Because if the Avos at that time, if Hashem gave us the land, and Hashem, like we said in the Bris Ben Absarim, he prescribed what those boundaries are, from Mitzrayim to the Euphrates River, etc., from the Har Mitzrayim, the river of Egypt, to the land all the way north, etc. It means there was a certain boundary, there was a certain border. And therefore, Yitzchak, even though Eretz Yisrael was not a land of Kedusha yet, it was still a Jewish territory. And therefore, since he was an Ola Tamima, since he was a perfect burnt offering, it is therefore Hashem is telling him in the positive, we own this land, this is our land, you belong here. There's something still special about this place, and therefore you should remain within the prescribed border, as we mentioned before. However, it remains a question according to Rashi. Not only was there no Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael at that time, we didn't even own it. So if that is the case, Rashi has to explain, we still don't understand, why can't Yitzchak leave? There should not be a fundamental difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Both of them, we did not have ownership. Both of them did not have that special Kedusha. So therefore, why did Hashem tell Yitzchak, don't leave, don't go down to Mitzrayim? So on this, the Rebbe says, we need to understand, perhaps, let's take a step back and analyze. As we mentioned before, there was a debate between Rashi and the Midrash. Was there an ownership of the land or not? Midrash says yes. As it says, Lazarach and Asati have already given the land, and therefore it's already a done deal. And Rashi disagrees and says, Hashem, it's sort of a figure of speech, because yes, the actions of the words of Hashem are deemed to be action, but there wasn't something that actually came to be until many years later. Why did Rashi disagree? Why does Rashi reject the approach of the Midrash and maintain that we can't say that the Jewish people actually own the land? So there's a fascinating perspective the Rebbe introduces us to, and that is, we know, as we mentioned before, the Avos, they observed the Torah in its entirety prior to the giving of the Torah. Avram, it says he fulfilled and observed the mitzvah of Erev Tavshilin, even rabbinic precepts he observed. So if the Avos, they studied Torah, we keep on hearing about the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, there was Torah study, there was observance of mitzvahs. What exactly happened when Hashem gave the Torah at Matan Torah? Seemingly, it was something that everyone was doing. Everyone was already studying Torah. Everyone was already fulfilling mitzvahs. And on a theme that the Rebbe would often talk about was this idea that there was a revolution at the time of Matan Torah, whereby prior to the giving of the Torah, there was this divide, there was this gap, the gulf between heaven and earth, spiritual and material. Yes, they were able to study Torah, they were able to observe mitzvahs, but ultimately the physical, the material world was never able to be truly transformed to be something holy. When the Avos gave tzedakah, when they fulfilled a mitzvah, There was no such transformation where there would be something as a chefza shel mitzvah, a object that became intrinsically and inherently holy and sacred. Not because they didn't want to, it just was not possible. The ability to bridge and to fuse, harmonize spiritual and physical was something that was only introduced at the giving of the Torah. Because once the Torah was given, Hashem commanded us. Prior to the giving of the Torah, everything was done of their own initiative. This ability to bridge physical and spiritual, you need an infinite power. Because spiritual and physical are opposites. How could the spiritual and physical harmonize and reside together? How could they be fused together? One is that there's an infinite gap, an infinite gulf. It's only with the power of the infinite, God, Hashem, who gives us the commandment, he gives us the power. So prior to Matan Torah, there was no mitzvahs, and therefore, everything they did was based on their ability. And therefore, only once the Torah was given, now you have actual articles, physical articles that become spiritual and holy. Why is this idea important? Because when we talk about Eretz Yisrael, when we talk about this land, not only did it become a holy place, it became a Jewish place. Rashi tells us in the beginning of the Torah says, Bereshis bara Elokim. The Torah opens with the creation of the world. And Rashi, the very first Rashi in the Torah says, why are we talking about the creation of the world? The Torah should have started with HaChodesh HaZalachem, the first mitzvos in the Parsha of Bo, about sanctifying the new moon. Speaking of mitzvahs, why is the Torah spending all this time about the creation of the world? It's just a story. The Torah should be about mitzvahs, about commandments. Why are we reading this whole story and narrative of creation? And Rashi says a fascinating thing. Because the nations of the world are going to come and say, you Jewish people, you are thieves. You stole the land of Eretz Yisrael. Listim atem, you are bandits. How can you take the land from us? And therefore, Rashi says the Torah begins with Bereshis bara Elokim to teach us that Hashem created the world, everything is his. He gave it to those nations, but ultimately, just the same Hashem that gave them the land, he decided really was for the Jewish people. Everything was created for us. He gave it to them, but ultimately, we are the ones who are to possess the land. And the Rebbe says, wait, I don't understand. Why are the nations coming and complaining, we're thieves, we're stealing the land? What do you mean we're stealing the land? Every single nation conquers land from another nation. How did that nation get it? They came and they conquered and they took it away from someone else. There were indigenous people in this place. They weren't really indigenous. There were people there before them and they conquered from those people and going all the way back to creation. So every nation, every country, every empire historically for thousands of years has gone to war, conquered land and called it their own. Why do the nations of the world come and say, we are the thieves? How are we different than anybody else? So the Rebbe says, no, there's something very, very different about Eretz Yisrael. And that is because when we come and we conquer Eretz Yisrael, what happens now is it didn't just become we conquered this land. What happens now, it's become a uniquely Jewish land. We have now transformed the Eretz Canaan into Eretz Yisrael, and forever, for generations, no matter what, we have severed any relationship that any other nation of the world has to this land because it's truly ours. And on this, the nation of the world says, how could you do that? Why are you different than any other country that comes, that conquers, but subsequently another nation will come and conquer it from them? So they're saying, you came and took Eretz Yisrael, but you were driven out. Some other nation came. Why are you still claiming Eretz Yisrael is yours? And on this, the Rebbe Hashem tells us because Bereshis bara Elokim, Hashem created the world this way. It was by divine design that the world was created in a way that this special land that Hashem chose will be Eretz Yisrael for eternity. So Rashi, circling back after we have all of this, what Rashi is telling us is forget about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. We're not even discussing the holiness of the land. Even the very ownership, the fact that Hashem would give us a land and we would call it Eretz Yisrael, a Jewish land, that is an absolute transformation of the very essence, the very property of the land. The very character of the land would become a Jewish character. It would identify as a uniquely Jewish land. So therefore, Rashi says such a transformation was not possible before Matan Torah. It was not, there was no ability for a land, which was just a land like any other land. How would it become transformed, become such a special land that would be identified and known as Eretz Yisrael? That could only come post Matan Torah, when Hashem would command us and say, go into Eretz Yisrael with Hashem's koach, with Hashem's command. It is only then that it could happen. So therefore, Rashi rejected that the opinion of the Medrash that there was an actual Jewish ownership of the land. Because it wasn't just like any other ownership, it was something that was very unique. And the truth is, even the Midrash, we could say, because of this idea, that's perhaps why all agree that there was no Kiddush on Eretz Yisrael, because indeed, to imbue within the land such a transformational holiness that it is now separate and unique from all other lands of the world, all would agree that this could only come to play and come to fruition after the giving of the Torah. So therefore, in the times of the Avos, both Rashi and Midrash agreed that there was no holiness, and even Rashi himself was of the opinion that even the ownership, the Jewish ownership, did not come into play. So in summary, what we have here is like this. We have Yitzchak, who is in Eretz Yisrael. There's a famine. He wants to go down to Mitzrayim, Hashem's, because he wants to escape the famine, the hunger. Hashem says, don't go. There are two explanations and two interpretations as to what Hashem told him. There's the explanation of the Midrash that underscores the positive Eretz Yisrael. Stay here. You're an Ola Tmima, you're a burnt offering. Stay here. Don't go out of Eretz Yisrael because this is where you belong. Rashi, who is highlighting the negative, don't go down there. It is not befitting for you. We show how both Rashi and the Midrash are not just saying two different things. They're actually highlighting, they're not just saying the same thing, they're highlighting two different things. Rashi is interpreting the words, don't go down to Mitzrayim, and in that vein, emphasizes the negative of the diaspora. You have the Midrash, who is highlighting the positive, where Hashem says, settle here, and emphasizing the positive of Eretz Yisrael. Both Rashi and the Midrash are of the opinion that Eretz Yisrael at that time did not have Kedusha. And as we just explained, the possible reason for that is because such a revolution that the physical land should become spiritual wasn't possible. It simply was not within the realm of the possibility at that time. It was only after the Matan Torah where that ability to fuse the spiritual and the physical, that a physical land can become holy, the time was not right for that. And therefore, the Midrash, however, was of the opinion that the Jewish people actually owned the land to a certain degree, already dating back to the Bris Bein Absarim. And as Hashem said, Lazarcha Nasati, I have given you the land. The Midrash is of the opinion that when Hashem said that, it actually it happened. Hashem said it, and right away, the ownership was transferred to the Avos. And therefore, since they owned the land, Yitzchak being an Ola Tmima, dating back to the time of the Akedah, just like every sacrifice has a prescribed boundary within which it needs to be, Yitzchak needs to be in his boundary. We right now have a boundary of Eretz Yisrael. This is where you belong. And this is, thus the Midrash is highlighting the positive. Stay here. There's something positive out here because we own this land. Yes, it may not be holy, but it's still our land. There's still something, there's a quality here that it belongs to us. And therefore, as a carbon, you should stay in these precincts, within these parameters. Rashi, as we mentioned, not only does he not believe that there was a Kedusha at that time, he rejects that there was even an ownership of the land, because a Jewish ownership, that itself is a transformational act that was not feasible at that point. So bottom line, we still have to explain according to Rashi, therefore, if the land wasn't holy and they didn't own the land, why should Yitzchak not go out? On this, Rashi says, you're an Ola Tmima, ein chutz la'aretz kadaylach, that the diaspora is not fitting for you. There still was a difference between Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz. What was the difference? Avram Avinu, what did he do for a living? We know he was the first outreach. He was the first shaliach. He had the Chabad house. As we are celebrating this weekend is the conference of the Shluchim. Avram was the pioneer of Shluchos. He did outreach. Vayikra Avram, the Avram Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem Kel Olam. His whole life was about disseminating and teaching the consciousness of Hashem. His whole purpose was he would meet someone to teach Hashem Echad, there is one God in this world. So that was his program, education. But where did Avram's outreach to teach about Hashem and his existence and teach them how to live a good life in the following the ways of Hashem? Avram, he lived in Beersheba, in Eretz Yisrael. His program, his outreach program was geared towards the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael, or at that time was the land of Canaan. So all the people in Eretz Yisrael had some knowledge and appreciation of Hashem. However, in the diaspora in Chutz La'aretz, there was no education. There was no knowledge of Hashem. In fact, we learned already in last week's parsha when Avram told Eliezer, I want you to go and find a shidduch for my son Yitzchak. He said, don't go here, don't here in Canaan. The people don't have the good midos. You should go to Haran because over there, that's my family. And over there, they have the proper proper midos, the proper character, appropriate character. When Eliezer asks, hang on a second, what happens if the girl does not want to come back? What if his Bashert doesn't want to come? Should I bring Yitzchak there? And Avram makes him swear, says, no way, don't bring him there. Because over there's no knowledge of Hashem. And Avram says, when I left there was nothing. There was nothing going on. There was no education. I came here and I inspired people. I taught them about Hashem. So Yitzchak can't live over there. So in other words, even though, according to Rashi, there was no holiness, there was no ownership of the land, as we mentioned before, at least there was still education. Still there was an awareness, a consciousness, a recognition of Hashem. And once you have that, that already creates the conditions, the environment where Yitzchak is appropriate for him to be. To go into Chutz La'aretz, he would be in an environment that is totally inconsistent and incompatible. The fact that he is an Ola Tmima, he has a very, very special status, therefore he doesn't belong there. So ultimately, what we have from all of this, that when we look at environments, we look at surroundings. Over here, as we mentioned before, there is one level we're saying is that there's Eretz Yisrael, a place where maybe there wasn't inherent holiness, maybe there wasn't Jewish ownership, but there was at least education. It was an environment where people had the awareness, they had the cognizance of the existence of Hashem because of Avram's teaching and outreach. Chutz La'aretz did not have it at all. So clearly, what we see from all of this, Hashem is telling Yitzchak, you're an Ola Tmima, it is inappropriate, you need to stay here. Now, how do we draw the lesson? Where do we draw the line from Yitzchak to ourselves in our own lives? We have ourselves, we have our lives, we have our children. On the one hand, we know that we need the proper environment for ourselves. Healthy environments are very, very important. And certainly this is the case for our children. But on the other hand, we go to work. We have our careers, we have our jobs, we need to interact with people. We need to go to the grocery store. We go sometimes to the doctor's office. There are all kinds of moments in lives where we can't just remain in our own box. We need to go out into the world and interface and interact with other people. And we have to expose not only ourselves, but also our children to this world. So clearly, number one, we need to know that there is an inevitability that we are exposed to the environments of the world, which, like the diaspora, oftentimes many of them are not exposed to the knowledge of Hashem, the awareness of Hashem, the existence of Hashem. But at the end of the day, we could try There are those that say, you know what, we need to be sheltered in our ivory towers. We need to be in the Jewish ghettos. They should not see the world, not smell the world. They should just study Torah the entire day. There are many that have that approach. But ultimately, we want to be in a position where we can interact with the world. But oftentimes that world is not very much consistent with our values and our ideals. So one of the things we take away from here is there are what we would call a holy environment, but then there's also a environment that has the knowledge of Hashem. In other words, according to Rashi, Eretz Yisrael did not have the inherent holiness. It did not have even the Jewish ownership. But what did it have? It had education. There was a certain level of appreciation of Hashem. So we see from this that sometimes it's not necessarily the environment needs to be a shul, which is inherently sacred and holy, or even a Jewish place, so to speak. You have people who go on shlichus, they go to places where there's no Jewish infrastructure at all. However, an important component, important ingredient is indeed that there should be the education, the knowledge of Hashem. That people, where we go, at least our attempt should be that place, there should be an awareness of Hashem, teaching the values of Torah and Yiddishkeit. And ultimately, if we do want to have an environment where we and our children can thrive, there has to be, maybe not necessarily we are tethered to the holy environment, but at least a knowledge and an appreciation for Hashem. And the Rebbe would often talk about this idea. There was the famous story of the chassid who came to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he wanted a bracha. He wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, and the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, "Mach da Eretz Yisrael, make here Eretz Yisrael," which is a fascinating perspective. Of course, we are not saying to discourage or diminish the importance of making Aliyah and living in Eretz Yisrael. True. But what the Tzemach Tzedek was saying, a fundamental idea. Like we mentioned before, that in Eretz Yisrael, at that time, prior to Matan Torah, it was not possible for the place to become holy because the spiritual and the physical could not be fused together. Today, we are post-Matan Torah. We have an advantage that the Avos didn't have. The best they could do for the environment was to teach about Hashem, to speak about Hashem to all those that they encountered. But what we have today is that we can actually make our environment holy because we are post-Matan Torah. So when we're in a place that is not Eretz Yisrael, we can make it Eretz Yisrael. There's a line from one of the Rishonim, one of the medieval commentators, the Meiri, who says, Kol makom shechachma v'yiras chet mitzuyim, sham dino k'Eretz Yisrael. Any place where there is wisdom and fear of Hashem, it is as if you're in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, we bring the values, we bring the intensity of the holiness to every encounter, every exchange, every dialogue, every circumstance, every opportunity that we have. We bring the feeling and the knowledge of Hashem wherever we go. And therefore, we bring that special. Now, of course, not to, like we said, to replace Eretz Yisrael Chas v'Shalom, but we bring that energy to every encounter that we have. So on the one hand, we have to have the holy spaces, the places where we have the Kedusha in our homes and cultivate that. It's very, very important. But on the other hand, we also have to take that holiness and bring it out into the world and transform all those places. And when we do that, we bring Eretz Yisrael everywhere. We prepare this world indeed for the coming of Mashiach, the Meher of Yameinu.